everybody. Chris Neidl here, the co-founder of the OpenAir Collective. I'm really excited that we're going to be kicking off a new advocacy mission that's going to be led by one of our members based in Luxembourg, Sven Clement. Sven is not only an OpenAir member, he's also a member of the Luxembourg Parliament representing the Pirate Party. And what we're excited about is with Sven, we have an opportunity to create a novel policy for Luxembourg that we think also might have broader application in other European countries and maybe even beyond. It's based on what's called the Feed-In Tariff, which was a policy that was used to catalyze development and investment in renewable energy in Germany, and then as well as in other European states. And it was fundamentally important to scaling up renewable energy and driving down the cost globally. So what we're interested in is what is the possibility of taking elements of that Feed-In Tariff and applying it to carbon dioxide removal in 2022 and beyond. And so that's the mission that Sven has set out on, and he's in a position to actually draft legislation and introduce it. So that's what we'll be doing in November, and we invite you to participate. One of the things that we wanted to provide as we embark on this effort beginning in November, which will include different roundtable sessions with experts who will give us some information and feedback on the policy idea so Sven can get it into legislative form. We're going to live stream those, and you're going to be able to actually view and submit your own ideas. But leading up into that, we also wanted to provide some separate information or resources they think would be helpful for people as they try to wrap their head around the basic idea of a feed-in tariff. And to that end, Sven and I were able to catch up and have a great conversation with Dr. Joern Hoppmann. Dr. Hoppmann is a full professor of management research at the University of Oldenburg. He has a PhD in management from ETH Zurich. And 6 or 7 years ago in 2014, he co-authored an excellent paper in the journal Research Policy, which I'll link in the show notes. He co-authored it with Jorn Huitler and Bastien Giraud. And it's called Compulsive Policymaking, the Evolution of the German Feed-In Tariff System for Solar Photovoltaic Power. And it's a great history of the policy, the rationale for why it was introduced, the political context in Germany in which it was introduced, and how it was changed and adapted over time to meet different political realities, but also to basically contend with some of the changes to the technology and the economics behind renewable energy. And so it's a really useful conversation we had because Professor Hoppmann was able to sort of tell us about how the feed-in tariff worked and give us some insights about how it might be adapted actually for other domains, including carbon dioxide removal. So we hope you enjoy this, and we hope that you'll be able to tune in and participate to our effort to develop a carbon dioxide feed-in tariff for Luxembourg and beyond. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Chris Neidl. I'm one of the co-founders of the OpenAir Collective, and I'm joined by Sven Clement. And today we're very excited to be talking to Professor Joern Hoppmann, who is a full professor of management at the University of Oldenburg. And the reason why we're speaking with him is that Professor Hoppmann co-wrote an excellent paper on the German feed-in tariff experience about 6 or 7 years ago called Compulsive Policymaking, the Evolution of the German Feed-In Tariff System for Solar Photovoltaic Power. And when we read that, we realized that Joern had a lot of the great background and analysis that we really want to dig into as we think about how the feed-in tariff model could be potentially a good basis for carbon dioxide removal policy. So what we're going to do right now is just have a conversation and get from Joern some of the background on the feed-in tariff, how it evolved as a policy, and looking back, really what's the final verdict on it in terms of how successful and impactful it was. Sven, anything you want to add to that? Did you want to get out of the conversation today?
Thanks, Chris, for having us, for arranging this. I think that will be very insightful to talk to Professor Hoppmann regarding feed-in tariffs in general. As we know, I'm working on a proposal to build feed-in tariffs around carbon removal. So the question is, how can we achieve this? How can we achieve the best result? And whom best to start with than one of the people that wrote a very exciting and interesting paper on feed-in tariffs when it came to solar. And I'm here to learn how we can use that to get CDR off the ground and to support that.
Great. And it really was an excellent paper, Professor Hoppmann. It kind of really filled a need for us because it really gave a history, essentially, of the policy, why it was introduced, what some of the considerations were, and then how it changed over time, which I think I think was one of the fascinating parts of the paper. So Professor Hoppmann, maybe what we could do, if you don't mind, just for our audience, if you could just very simply, we could start off and could you just define the basic elements of what a feed-in tariff is?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me. So, very exciting opportunity to talk about the feed-in tariff and yeah, maybe lay some groundwork for some more exciting policies to happen in the future. So, feed-in tariff generally is a policy instrument that has historically been used to increase the share of renewable energy in the grid, basically. And how would you do that? You would basically do that by granting producers of renewable electricity a price for the electricity that is fed into the grid that is above the market price. The idea is that it's basically set an incentive for these producers to produce electricity in the first place from renewables, and thereby also increase the incentive to invest in technologies and thereby basically create a market for these technologies in the first place. So especially for solar, it was very important to create a market. So one important element is basically that you would grant this price, right? So it has to be above market price. Usually it has been fixed over a specific amount of time. So for example, in Germany, if you were to invest in a solar panel that you put on your rooftop, for example, then you would be granted a fixed price for the electricity that you feed into the grid for 20 years, which creates a lot of certainty for investors, which is very important for calculating investments. The second thing that's very important is that you would have specific prices depending on the technology. So you would have a feed-in tariff that's higher, or at least used to be higher for solar PV than for wind, for example. Electricity costs for wind were lower, so basically the price also had to be lower because you wanted to prevent windfall profits that would then simply go to the investors. So important, so it has to be technology specific. It also has to be, or at least in Germany, it was specific to the size of the plant. Why that? So small rooftop solar plants are usually more expensive when it comes to the electricity that's being generated than utilities size solar plants. So that's why you would usually have a specific price that's higher for rooftop solar than for utility scale solar. And then another or two more important features, I guess, are the degression mechanism. So degression meaning that this price that would be paid as part of the feed-in tariff would decrease over time. So not for you when you invest. So the 20 years would be fixed. Basically, you would get the price for 20 years. But if I were to invest again in 5 years from now, for example, then usually the price that I would get would be lower. Why again? Because solar photovoltaic technology prices in the market, they basically fall as more PV is being installed. So basically simple mass production effect, learning curve effects. And so it wouldn't make sense to give people the same feed-in tariff in, let's say, 5 years compared to today. And then finally, two more important points are, the German feed-in tariff system, usually there was preferred access to the grid for renewables. So that was kind of a very important precondition. So renewables were given priority access to the grid so that all the electricity that came from the feed-in tariff was preferentially fed in. So that's quite important too. And finally, one question, of course, is how would you then, who would pay for these extra costs that emerge due to the fact that you would pay a price above market prices? The answer to that in the German system was that basically that was paid by electricity consumers. So both private and industrial electricity consumers would pay a surcharge that was added to the electricity bill in the end. And that was quite important because in the end, everyone paid for the additional solar installations and the increase in the share for solar. So that's, from my perspective, the most important elements that we would see in the feed-in tariff.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And one of the things that you more or less alluded to, but seems very important, is it sort of democratized participation to a certain degree because it didn't really cap the size of it, and the rules were relatively simple for how somebody could participate. So it sort of opened up the whole field of who could potentially not just be paying for it on their sort of electricity consumer fees, but investing in renewables and actually getting benefit from it. And that piece of it, to what extent do you think that part of it, making it available to many different types of people, was the sort of key to its longevity. Did that, do you think, have any sort of relationship to the success of the policy or its long run over time?
Yes, the longevity in Germany has a couple of reasons. So why it was so successful, and also for a longer period of time. But certainly this democratizing aspect was part of it. So the idea that everyone could participate, everyone could pretty much install a PV on their rooftop and would get this feed-in tariff. That was very important to the general acceptance of the technology. So it spread quite quickly. And in PV, there's what we call a neighborhood effect or a peer effect. So people would actually look at their neighbor's rooftop and see, okay, there's a cool new solar panel installed. And even if they're skeptical, they would start talking to their neighbors and notice, okay, well, that's sort of an investment opportunity. I can actually make a return from that. And so that helped very much spread the technology and also very much increase the acceptance, because everyone could participate also financially in the system. Some other aspects that were important for the longevity, I guess, is that, I mean, first of all, there was broad consensus, even among those parties that normally wouldn't consider very green, that renewables should be implemented in Germany. So general goal of implementing renewables was shared, even though the means were quite debated, but so the general goal was not debated. So in that sense, that certainly helped. So even as the parties changed in government, the system wasn't dismantled. What also helped was certainly that this feed-in tariff helped build an industry around solar in Germany. So of course, with industry comes jobs and comes lobbying power, if you will. That became a very strong argument. That's, I guess, a couple of important points.
Yeah, and to look at, I think it's remarkable, particularly looking at it from a US perspective, the continuity that happened and how the different parties that were in power and aligned had different core rationales for why they wanted the policy to stick around, which I think is really fascinating. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the main chapters which you lay out in your paper of where the policy started and how it and why it evolved over time, and how, from a policymaking perspective, they were able to make those adjustments, which I think says something about the feed-in tariff, that it could bend and not break. And maybe start, though, with why Germany? You know, it was a landmark policy that has had a huge impact. Why did it start in Germany?
Sure. So let's start with why Germany. So if we go back to the 1970s or so, I guess we had the oil crisis, and that was something that happened all over the world, but that basically triggered a lot of thoughts about, okay, how can we create a basically new electricity system where we're not so much dependent on fossil fuels. So that's not very specific to Germany, but what also happened in Germany very strongly was that there was a strong anti-nuclear movement, and sort of later, together with the peace movement, became the Green Party. But a very strong anti-nuclear movement, basically triggered by the Chernobyl accident also. And around this movement, so both these social movements against oil and against nuclear, they very much triggered a thought process about what could be alternatives. And so in the 1970s already, you had some R&D programs on solar, on wind. Again, not very specific to Germany, but especially the social movement part of it was very strong in Germany. So in the end, that led to the foundation of the Green Party, led to a lot of local initiatives that wanted to sort of push for renewables. And so we had especially, so in the early 90s already, local initiatives in many smaller cities in Germany where feed-in tariff systems were tried out. And some initial demonstration programs, such as the 1,000 roofs program and the 100,000 roofs program in Germany. So basically demonstration programs where the idea was to test the technology, try to figure out how it works. And that basically laid the ground for then later the feed-in tariff, because in the year 1998, then the Green Party, because of a lot of support in the population, finally came to power. So they were part of the government, the red-green government. And that was really the point where then the nuclear phase-out was determined. And at the same time, it became clear that there would be a strong push toward renewables. So in the year 2000, basically the Renewable Energies Act was then basically brought to place. And that was really kind of quite a milestone, I would say, in the renewables policy. And So that basically implemented the feed-in tariff. So there had been a feed-in tariff already in 1991, but that feed-in tariff actually didn't work because it didn't quite set the same level of incentives as the 2000 feed-in tariff did. And the 2000 feed-in tariff was really designed according to the elements that I laid out earlier. Again, it was a bit more of a careful approach because the parties weren't quite sure how it would work. So there was a ceiling also in how much electricity, for example, could be, or how much capacity could be installed, at least in the solar part. And so they tried that out, and then they noticed, okay, well, that seems to work. And the industry actually grew around that, and so more and more was installed. Quite a success. And in 2004, so they then took away the ceiling, adjusted the incentive levels so that the incentives were even higher than they had been set in the year 2000. And that really led to quite a boom in solar in the year 2004. So policymakers then started to think about how can we get control over these costs, and so they excluded some of the more heavy industry that had high electricity costs, and also basically put in some measures that would increase the digression later. So that was the main part of the years 2009 to 2011, that there was a lot of tinkering around trying to reduce the costs created by the system, while at the same time, as I said earlier, so the industry was building up quite strongly around the solar feed-in tariff. So a lot of solar industry in Germany, and so there was a bit of a debate: how much can we reduce the costs without basically hurting the industry? And so then the later phases, so starting in 2012 around, were then related to market integration and grid integration questions. So as the feed-in tariff was still sort of spurring investments, spurring the diffusion of solar, the question came up, so how can we make the system a bit more market, or create a bit more of a market-oriented system? So try to set incentives in a way that it also is more demand-oriented, if you will. And so depending on how much electricity is actually needed, how can we then set incentives that would trigger the supply in that regard? So that's the general story. And I guess if you look at the more current developments, a lot of the incentives are still in place, right? So the feed-in tariff still exists, but for bigger plants, there has been a push more toward tendering mechanisms. Again, basically, the main motivation behind that was that policymakers were trying to make more use of the market, trying to push prices even lower than they could with the feed-in tariff system. But that's only doable. These tendering mechanisms are only doable for bigger systems. So the smaller households still can make use of the feed-in tariff systems. So now that solar, due to the feed-in tariff system, has reached a price point where it's actually competitive with retail prices, retail electricity prices, basically as an inherent incentive for households to build solar PV plants and use electricity on their own, because basically the electricity that you produce and generate and use is cheaper than what you could buy it from the electric utility. So to a certain extent, these incentives that were set from the feed-in tariff system or by the feed-in tariff system are no longer necessary, but for a long time they were, and they were very important in spurring the development.
I think thanks. I think that the interesting part of the German story is really how, despite changing government coalitions, the feed-in tariff never has been really put up for debate. There have been debates, but they have been minor and on the fringes, on technicalities. But the principle, and I think the explanation is very interesting, that the industry has grown so quickly that it became too big to fail in a certain sense, and that government couldn't really say, oh, no, we will go back and abolish the feed-in tariff. And I think that's maybe the interesting part from a policymaker perspective, that we managed, or that Germany managed somehow to introduce something that generated effects quickly enough for it to become so important that nobody would touch it. And I think that's maybe one of the lessons I take out of these explanations. A second lesson is probably the same, that when it comes to bigger plants And keeping in mind that I'm thinking more about the modular and smaller home scale plants than utility scale solutions, that we can have different tools in our toolbox, depending on whether we are looking at a modular solution at home or maybe on a block level, whereas a utility scale solution can have completely different market mechanisms, like a tendering or even direct subsidies, whatever makes the most sense for that type of R&D and deployment. So it's very interesting. And maybe if I can add on top of that, how do you see the impact the feed-in tariffs had on job creation as a whole? I think you mentioned we've seen the industry grow, but obviously, did it grow first on the job side or first on the R&D side? That's maybe something that is of interest for colleagues of mine that are policymakers and that would really like to prove to their constituents that creating feed-in tariffs creates jobs.
Right. So yes, this narrative that feed-in tariff important to create jobs, that was there from the beginning, and I guess it was extremely important, as you also mentioned in the political debate, both to introduce the feed-in tariff, but also then later to keep it going. So if we look at the job effect the feed-in tariff system has had, it's quite a complex effect actually. So we have to be very careful in trying to dismantle that, or look at it in very detail. So first of all, as I said, so with the feed-in tariff in place, generally the number of jobs grew. So where did they grow? They at the very beginning, actually, a lot of PV panels were imported because simply there was no industry. And then over time, basically the German value chain around PV was developed. What was there from the beginning, especially at the market grew, was installers, right? So because you basically didn't have foreign installers in Germany because you had to have a local knowledge of, and you had to have basically this installed in your neighborhood. So it was mostly, craftsmen, basically people that already had their small craft shops or whatever, who then started installing PV panels. So basically people that also would install heating systems or so. And so they basically, but there was sort of a specialization taking place. So increasingly people also installing then PV systems only. What also then grew very strongly was the cell and module part later. So that took a bit, of course, to build up the capacities, but that sort of grew quite quickly. And also, and quite importantly, also the inverter part. So there was this buildup of companies, and as the market sort of grew, so that led to quite a significant growth in jobs. But as then later the growth sort of decelerated a bit, so was no longer as strong. Also, some of the downstream jobs, so jobs in installation, of course, disappeared quite quickly, right? So, and that's kind of natural. So if you have a market that grows and you need people that install it, and then of course that's leading to a lot of jobs. But as the market disappears, so there's no jobs, as there's no panels being, or not so many panels being installed in Germany any longer, of course, you would also see these jobs disappear quite quickly again. What also disappeared quite a bit was the cell and module part, because there was strong competition from China. Again, that part is quite complicated, and because in the end, many of these jobs disappeared because German equipment manufacturers that learned how to build solar equipment, they started to export their equipment to China, and so the Chinese were able to catch up very quickly due to the knowledge that was built into the equipment. So the equipment part was always a strength of the German PV system, and there are also still a lot of companies that are very good in building PV manufacturing equipment. What happened to many of these people that used to work in the solar industry, though, and so they basically, of course, didn't disappear, but many of them continued working in German electric utility companies. And so that also, I guess, could be, or is, from my perspective, an important part of the story that sort of triggered a shift in the general, more broader electricity sector So in the end, quite a boost in jobs at the beginning, some loss in jobs, but again, the knowledge didn't disappear, and it sort of triggered quite a change in the electricity system from my perspective.
We talked about the political coherence, I guess you could say, in Germany that allowed for this policy to survive across multiple administrations. But on the policy design part too, I wonder what seems important about the feed-in tariff is it has these pieces you can calibrate. So it's what the prices are of the tariffs for different types of technologies and the rate at which they decline, that you can adjust the knobs essentially as you go. And that seems to be really, really key to how it was able to sort of survive, because it could be changed over time. Do you agree that there's this sort of a flexibility built into the policy that helped it survive?
Yes, very much so. So that's a very important part of it. Even at the beginning, so when the feed-in tariff was set up in the year 2000, they already had what they called experience reports. And so they basically, back then, the idea was to review the policy every 4 years and look at how successful it was and what would need to be changed. And so I guess that was this revision process, I guess, this built-in idea that you would basically look at the policy over and over again, adjust it. I think that was an extremely smart idea, because what our research also shows is that basically if you have policies such as the feed-in tariff, you intervene in the technological systems so strongly, and so we make so many important changes that it's very difficult to predict what will happen. And so in the end, you will have to sort of adjust your policy because some unexpected effects will occur. So in the end, it's very important to consider that upfront and think about how you would revise policies, how you would learn from maybe mistakes or just unexpected developments. So it might not even be a mistake, might just be that you cannot foresee it. So that's one of the points I think that's very, very important. And so flexibility is important, and that certainly has to do with legislative processes. You have to kind of go through the process of revising it, and you have to be able to do that quite quickly. But it also has to do with administrative processes, I think. So, I mean, parts of the feed-in tariff system in some countries, for example, in Switzerland, so the adjustment of the feed-in tariff level would be done at an administrative level by a federal agency. So I guess that's also a good way of doing it, because then you're even more flexible in adjusting parts of it that are not as critical to the basic design, but would sort of keep it going and would prevent any wrong developments, such as windfall profits to investors that you wouldn't want to see.
It seems like in as a cautionary tale, I know in some of the other European states like Spain and Italy, for instance, which adopted a feed-in tariff, and part of it was timing right before the financial crisis. But my understanding is they sort of took some of that flexibility out by legislating the actual tariffs, I think, into the law. Was that correct? That they sort of took a course that was a bit more rigid and they paid a price for it?
Yeah, well, that's also my impression, that it was more rigid. And also, I guess in the case of Spain, they did not finance, at least to my knowledge, did not finance the feed-in tariff system through the electricity bills of consumers, but through the public budget. And of course, if you have billions that you spend each year on subsidizing, I mean, depending on how you want to say it, subsidizing, supporting solar, of course, that becomes much more visible if you're having it in the public budget, and becomes much more easy to cut, if you will, right? And so that, of course, happens also if you have a change in party, then of course these cuts can happen much faster than if you go through the electricity bill. Why? Because if you were to ask people in Germany, so what exactly are you paying for electricity, a lot of people wouldn't actually know. And so basically the fact that it was paid through the electricity bill helped, in the sense that many people didn't even know that they were paying a surcharge, and in the end, this supporting came somewhat unnoticed by many.
I just wanted to jump in regarding the payment mechanism, and I know there's also currently a debate in Germany whether to increase the cost transparency of renewables and energy in general, whether the current scheme should be maintained or whether it should be changed, abolished. So I agree that obviously it helps for consumers to not necessarily see that they are paying directly for the rooftop solar of their neighbor. At the same point, it might be exactly what helps them to realize that them as well could profit from such an investment. So I'm a bit in between chairs here when it comes to whether it's good to hide it in the energy cost or whether it would be better to put it into a taxation scheme. I think that will be a discussion we should elaborate on in our next calls and in our sessions, what would make the most sense. But I totally understand that historically it seems like the winning choice, as Germany has done it and it worked, and nobody ever went on the street with yellow vests to protest higher energy costs. I think nowadays we are in a slightly different world where people are watching energy prices very closely, and where energy poverty is not only a combination of words we are using, but something that some people are actively experiencing every day. So I think we need to be very careful on how to implement future feed-in tariffs when it comes to the compensation. But I think it's absolutely, it was the right way in the past to do it.
Yeah. I think what you just raised is a really important point. And again, we'll have to see how it transfers to a carbon dioxide removal context. There's obviously huge differences between an electricity grid and this entirely nascent field of basically carbon removal and sequestration. So, one of the things that you did mention, Joern, that is of interest to me, and you said that there was local precedence. We look back at the feed-in tariff and it looks like this national program that sort of just popped out of a box. But a lot of the ideas were sort of bubbled up, I think, from more local jurisdictions. And that's interesting to me too, Sven, when we think about within the Euro context, a policy can kind of take hold in one particular, context and then sort of spread. So it is interesting to think of a state like Luxembourg, which is a smaller state, could still be a place where you implement a policy that can then be, sort of resonate or be learned from, more broadly within Europe. So, but if you could, Joern, just in terms of those roots, those local instances, could you just give us a little bit of a background on the sort of antecedents, I guess, to the national program?
Yeah, sure. So, I've not done a lot of research on that, but there's nice books written about that history. So especially, for example, in Aachen, I know that there was, so it's a city not too far from Luxembourg, actually, and North Rhine-Westphalia. So it's a city where that was tried out at the local level. Also in Bavaria, you had a couple of municipalities that were trying things out. And so why it was important was really that there was not really a lot of knowledge about how you would implement it on a policy level, right? So utilities usually were resisting these types of changes because then they were fearing that that would take part of their share away, and somehow they would pay extra costs. And of course, there was a lot of administrative effort related to basically having feed-in tariffs and having people feed their electricity into the grid. So there was quite a lot of resistance at the local level, and a lot of debate on how you would write the laws basically to make that happen. In these local initiatives, there was also then basically quite a lot of lawsuits, but basically they're trying to figure out, okay, how could you implement it? How would you interpret the existing laws? How would things need to be changed? And so a lot of these elements that I explained earlier on, they basically emerged as a result of these initiatives, because it became clear, okay, you had to have this preferential access to the grid. Otherwise, utilities wouldn't let you feed it in the first place. You would have to have certain mechanisms in place, for example, to prevent windfall profits, but also set the right level of incentive. So that was really local learning taking place. And I totally believe that that's very important. I think it's a good starting point, because then you can try things out while not facing too much resistance, maybe.
I can't agree more. It's especially the experience from Bavaria, where small municipalities with a few dozen, not even hundreds of residents started experimenting and working more towards autarky than towards we'll save the planet, has been very inspiring in the sense that you wouldn't look in the most conservative parts of Germany to find the most renewable innovation. And it clearly shows that this is not a partisan issue, but it's bipartisan by design. And the question is, in the end, which will be partisan is always how will we adjust the different mechanisms. But I've got another question. Maybe Joern can elaborate a bit. We already talked about the costs and how they got compensated through the Erneuerbare Energieumlage. My question is, weren't there concerns about runaway costs and at some point the costs not being manageable anymore? Or did the policymakers build in hard ceilings where they could at least manage the costs, if ever it would be more successful than they hoped for?
So the concerns were there. So especially at the beginning, politicians didn't quite know what to expect from that policy. So it wasn't quite clear how successful it would be and how much it would cost. That's why at the beginning, in the initial designs, you actually had a ceiling for the installed capacity for solar. I know that. And later, basically, the costs were managed by having goals for the annual installed capacity for solar. So basically saying, okay, our target is X gigawatts of solar. And then if you basically exceed that target, the feed-in tariff would be lowered almost automatically. So there was a dynamic regression mechanism. And if you were below that target, basically they would slightly adjust the feed-in tariff upward. But yes, there was always a concern, and I guess that's extremely important to keep that in mind. If you don't have any other sort of redistribution mechanisms, right? So you could also, in the case of carbon, of course, you could always say, put a price on carbon, and then we have some redistribution of the money that we get from that, basically in a socially equitable or fair way. But of course, in the feed-in tariff system, so the general idea was really to have the surcharge, and so it didn't go through any type of taxation system. So.
Yeah, just to close, two points. I guess one specific policy point, and one just sort of almost a postmortem. If you could kind of give us your sense on looking back, how is the feed-in tariff viewed in Germany in terms of its success? But that first question, which I think is really relevant to where we are with CDR right now, is in your paper, you wrote how there was a debate between different parties about whether the appropriate role for government was to let's still focus on investing in R&D, some of the sort of supply upstream sort of conditions. And then the one that won out with the feed-in tariff was, no, we need to be directly involved in catalyzing demand. And that obviously is what the feed-in tariff does. Could you explain through your research how that sort of debate played out and why it is that the demand side, feed-in tariff side, ultimately prevailed?
Yeah, so that's almost a dogmatic question, if you will, also from a research perspective, right? So if you look at research, the early studies dealing with innovation, they always said, okay, R&D is what we basically have to do. Basic R&D is how innovations emerge, and that was what you call the technology push sort of factor. But it has become clear over time that basic demand pull, so basically having a strong market is equally important, and it's the two that have to work together. So from perspective, and politically, those more conservative parties were always closer to this general idea of markets should select, and you shouldn't intervene too much into the market. And that's also a debate that you see in the US quite strongly. So this idea was really more toward R&D. So or then basically favors R&D, right? So you would basically say, okay, let's put in some R&D subsidies, equally distributed, so we don't create any winners, and then the best technology will finally make its way into the market. So that was also basically the arguments that we would see, especially by the liberal Democrats in Germany at the beginning, but also by the CDU, so the Conservative Party. The Greens, and especially the Greens, not so much the Social Democrats, but especially the Greens, they I think they had realized very early that there was a bit of a chicken egg problem, or sort of a vicious circle that was in place, because without a market in place, the technologies are expensive because you don't reach the scale, you don't reach mass production. But if basically the technologies are too expensive, you don't get the market, right? So in the end, you never get to anywhere. And so they had realized that very early, and had basically drawn the right conclusions from that by putting in place these mechanisms for creating the markets. And the debate on whether the market push came too early or too late or so, I guess it's very difficult to make. Even in retrospect, it's very, very difficult to say, okay, when's the right point? Of course, you need some basic R&D at the beginning and need to create the technologies before you can pull anything. But then, of course, the question is, okay, when should you pull? There, it's a bit of so the risk of pulling too early is a bit that you really create winners because as soon as you create the market, basically the technologies that are most mature are being drawn into the market, and some technologies that have a great potential but are not there yet, they might actually lose because they don't benefit from the scaling effect so much. And that's also what we see in solar. So it's a bit of a tricky question of when you pull, but that you should pull, that I guess is not debated. So it's extremely important to create these markets, and because a lot of the learning takes place in the markets, a lot of the cost reduction come through economies of scale, through learning by doing, and that you cannot reach by investing in R&D, because that's basically scaling and mass production effects that you need to then leverage.
Yeah, definitely important considerations, Sven, as we go about this exercise. And just to conclude, to close again, if you could, a lot of it you've already highlighted in your in the perspective you've offered, but looking back right now, as you said, a good policy is one that kind of eliminates its need to exist. And I would say that in fundamental ways, the feed-in tariff was very successful. But can you tell us how it's sort of perceived right now, looking back within Germany? Is it considered successful? And there's some major lessons, I guess, that you would sort of distill in closing, about the feed-in tariff?
Yeah, again, overall, I guess there's a pretty big consensus, more so than even a couple of years ago, that the energy transition is extremely important. So there's no debate about that, I guess. So everyone considers that important. Overall, I guess there's a bit more of a realization now, which actually didn't happen during the debate a couple of years ago, but more and more people are realizing that even though it was supposed to be a national industry policy / technology policy, the effects were global. And I guess that's really, from my perspective, also one of the most important takeaways, even though it might not be the most economically efficient policy. So if you were to ask a macroeconomic scholar, they would say that better implement an emissions trading system. But it was extremely successful in lowering technology costs. And because these technology costs don't only fall for German PV panels, but fall globally, it's really enabled quite a shift in many, many countries. So if you look at where solar is being installed now, that would have been completely unimaginable a couple of years ago. And so the German Feed-In Tariff system played a very important role in triggering that change and making the technology more broadly available. In that sense, it's an extremely useful and helpful innovation policy, and from my perspective, also a very good development in climate policy. Even though as an industry policy, you can somewhat say, okay, it's been mixed, the effects, but the global effects were certainly very important.
Excellent. Lot of really, really great perspective, Professor Hoppmann. Appreciate it. A lot for us to sort of look at and explore as we go about designing our novel policy here. Sven, did you have anything you wanted to close with? I thought that was excellent.
Yeah, I'm a bit speechless, which happens rarely for a politician. I will have a lot to digest to wrap my head around. I think that especially the verdict on the feed-in tariff and the perspective of not only in doing something that worked locally or nationally, but finally had a global impact without the authors of the law necessarily having asked for that, gives me train for thought. And it's very interesting to see how sometimes small initiatives can lead to something very impressive. Thank you for your insights. I think that we made a huge circle around the whole feed-in tariff concepts, from the origins to where they are standing today and the challenges ahead. For me, I'm still convinced, and maybe a bit more than before, that a feed-in tariff could be the right structure to entice carbon removal projects. At this point, I'm very happy, thankful for the insights, and hope to have much more fruitful exchanges over the coming weeks when it comes to our idea. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thanks, Sven. And again, thanks, Professor Hoppmann. That was great. And we'll keep you posted on our progress. And hopefully we can continue to maybe get some feedback from you as this idea continues to progress. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and very welcome. It was fun talking to you too.
Thank you.